all for coming tonight. Is it cold enough for everybody? I'm kind of tired of winter. I don't know about you. We certainly thank Dick Greminger for letting us use his facility again. Yeah. You know, we love having you at the museums. You can stroll around and look at the museum too, but it's kind of nice here too to stretch and spread out a little bit. So we'll see how it goes. We may keep having them here, or we may move them back to the museum. We'll see how that goes. We'll play that by ear. So again, thanks to Dick Greminger, and be sure and help yourself. He's got the bar open, or if you'd like to go on the other side, get an appetizer. Coming up this Saturday is Dino Lab Day, and it's going to be from 10 to 4. And this is your chance to watch the Missouri dinosaur be uncovered bone by bone. And we have Michael Fix here. He is our unboner. Paleontologist that digs those little bones out of the jacket. So he's in the lab most often. We've got homeschool series. How many of you know that we do special sessions for homeschoolers? So we like to make sure that we hit every segment of the population. And those kids, they need stuff to do. So we've got a whole series of homeschool lessons for them. And homeschool students can enjoy free admission to the museum for these lessons. They must be accompanied by an adult. Students work toward receiving a junior ranger badge from the National Park Service, so we kind of teamed up with them. So it's kind of a neat thing for homeschoolers. Our speaker series keeps on rolling, and if you've got some particular topic you'd like us to address in our speaker series, please bring it to our attention. We'll track it down, or if you know someone in particular, we'll ask them and make it part of our series. We try and do at least 2 a month, if possible. And they've gone over very well. Coming up in our speaker series, after this evening, of course, we've got Bob Mueller. He has a fascinating program for us on January 29th, Leaving No Stone Unturned, and he'll walk us through mining and quarrying St. Genevieve's underground resources. Jim Baker, who's also in the audience here tonight, he's going to do a presentation on February 19th. That'll be, again, here at the Orris, so will Bob Mueller's. And what the tour guides don't tell you, that's what his talk is going to be about, and he'll tell you things you just won't find in Wikipedia anywhere, and it'll be a little spicy, he tells me, so be on the lookout for that. And on February 26th, we've got Charlie Bargman. He's going to talk about the Perryville Airport when it was a pilot training facility during World War II. How many of you knew that they trained pilots down there? A few of you? Yeah, it's a very interesting story, so that's coming up as well. How many of you are members here at the museum? Quite a few, that's great. This is one of the perks. You get to come to all of our speaker series free of charge. Those of you who had to pay admission today, if you'd like to become a member, you still can, and apply tonight's admission to that. In fact, you know, those of you who are already members, I hate to tell you this, but we have a special going on this month. Through January, we're having a membership drive. You can purchase a family membership for the price of an individual membership, so basically half price. Sorry, everyone runs specials, we gotta do it. So anyway, so without further ado, I think I better get going because we need to leave room for our presenter, Jim Francis, and Jesse Francis.
It's my brother.
Getting my feet, oh, that's your brother. So we like to get going here, but we would like to tell you that the museum is supported strictly by admissions, sponsorships like we have tonight. Riverside Landscaping is our sponsor for this evening. Let's give a hand for Riverside Landscaping. We have a few grants come our way once in a while, and great donations coming our way as well. So that's how we support the museum. So you're a big part of that. So Jesse Francis is tonight's speaker, and many of you probably know him already. He's been in and around St. Genevieve for quite a time. Jesse is currently the St. Louis County Parks Cultural Site Manager. From 1987 to 2015, he was museum curator at the St. Louis County Department of Parks and Recreation, working with restoration and preservation of buildings within St. Louis County's Faust Park. 1981 to the present, he was a restorationist and preservationist and a contractor with JWF Restoration LLC. I assume that's you. JWL Restoration, right?
Yes, sir.
And from 2020 to the present, consultant to the St. Genevieve National Historic Park Service. He's worked on several St. Genevieve projects like the Lamandir House, the Green Tree Tavern, Beckett Ribot House, Amaro House, Shaw House, the Visitor Center, Southern Hotel, even the St. Genevieve Museum Learning Center. He's received a number of awards and accolades along the way and produced numerous educational videos and programs. There's a lot more, but then we wouldn't have time for your program. But he is quite the storyteller, so please welcome Jesse Francis to talk about paths, trails, and rails.
I hope there's a refund when this is over. If not, I apologize. You come up to the park and I'll give you a tour. Can't afford to get you in the butterfly house, but the historical stuff I can cover. So anyway, after that disclaimer's been spoken, I'll get going. So basically, a few years ago, we started putting together information about how you got around, how you got from point A to point B. Next slide, please. So, you're going to start out with transportation. You're going to use the easiest way to get around, and that is a dugout canoe. That is a dugout canoe that was found on the Missouri River up in Jackson County. It is walnut. Most dugout canoes are made out of cottonwood or other materials that they could get, but whatever you could get a hold of, that's what they did. They dated it to 1690, which I'm a little questionable about that, way up near Kansas, but it's possible. So anyway, that's what one would look like. Dugouts, sometimes they're burnt, sometimes they're chopped, but they say that they actually saw modern, or not modern, but iron tool markings in that dugout canoe, which tells you that the Native Americans were not chopping it out with a stone axe. Next slide, please. So, transportation. Marquette and Joliet came down the river and saw this giant bird carved on the bluffs on the Illinois side. They get down and they start hearing this roaring noise. They didn't know what it was. They thought it was the end of the world coming. So the priest started praying, and the Marquette and Joliet, and the other one started paddling, and they got down, and all of a sudden, there's stumps and roots and trees coming in on the river, and they go, the river comes from a nice clear stream to mud, called the Missouri River coming into the Mississippi. If you've ever been to the confluence, you can attest to that. If you haven't been, you should go. It's quite an impressive sight. Next slide, please. So these are some other things. These were actually made for the Lewis and Clark reenactment, and the state of Missouri would use these boats on the river. They came up to our Fort Bell Fountain, which was actually established, and there when Lewis and Clark came back down the river. Next slide, please. There's another example of a dugout canoe. I think this one dated to around 1820. Next slide. So, you're going up and down the river, you're traveling the river, and then you're going to try to go up. You ever try to go up the Missouri River? I've gone down it in a kayak, but going up it, not an easy task. The difference between now and then is they put these stone sections out, and it causes everything to change. As you go up the river without those, it actually has a kickback current that'll help you go up the river, which is what they would use most often. Now, land trails. The oldest land trail we know of that exists is one that used to be right around here, the 3-Notch Road. Also, the Native Americans would use trees to mark their direction. I'm not positive that's what this is, but it's the closest example I've seen to a tree that points a direction on which way to go. Marking trees was something they would do because they thought the trees would last forever. Most of their lifetimes, which is around 30, 40 years old, it did last forever. So anyway, we think that is a tree that marks a trail, okay, by the Native Americans. So you had the Osage, the Missouri, quite a few of the other tribes coming over. Next slide. These are some of the dotted lines or some of the trails, the Osage Trail going up north. They would travel from here all the way into Oklahoma, Kansas, and western areas to hunt buffalo in the hunting season, and then back down to the southeast Missouri. Had so much land that Mr. Shota was given a 25,000 acre land claim by the Osage, which was denied by the fellow who owned the house at my park. So Mr. Shota and Mr. Bates did not get along at all because of things like that. But you can see the different paths in different areas. They tried to avoid as much as they could those Ozark Mountains. So if you see the trails going up into the Mississippi and Missouri area, and then the Warpath trails, the Aborigine trails. This was done by Lewis Houck. So if you pull up Lewis Houck's book, you'll get a closer view of exactly the names of the trails and where they were located. Next slide, please. This is one of the examples of a 3-notch road. Okay, there was 3 of those in 1986 when I went over on the 3-notch road with a fellow from Madison County, and you could actually see the grooves cut in the stone where the wagons would go across. So what they would do, they wanted to get to lead mines. This is around 1720. They would go over to get lead and they would haul it back. Different ways, mostly in a 2-wheeled cart. They would load up what they could and drag it across. Well, you drag across sandstone, you're going to leave grooves in sandstone. It's not quite like the Oregon Trail where they're really cut rut deep ruts, but it's visible in a few areas in lower St. Francis, Madison, and a little bit of Perry County. Next slide, please. If you turn that sideways, which I had another slide, but I didn't get it in, you'll see bumps where they stick out from the axe mark getting hit and it's swelling up and sealing around them. So that's a closest thing to we could get on what a cart might look like that they would haul the ore with, basically using oxen. And if you look at the inventory, a lot of oxen around here for hauling heavy weights. Next slide, please. So this is the dedication marker in beautiful downtown Mine Lamont. If you go there today, you need to watch where you're walking, because if you go off in the backwoods around, you will find shafts all over the place. They basically start a hole and go down and follow the lead. And it might only be 8 feet across, but it might go down 40 feet or 50. You get lost in there pretty quick, and if you fall in, nobody's going to find you, and very few people will hear you. A few notorious things have happened to some people, and they would wind up finding them 10 or 15 years later in one of those holes. Don't know if it was done illegally or legal, or they just was hunting and didn't pay attention to where they were going. Same thing happens from here to old mines. And matter of fact, we were working on a French house in Dupont, Illinois, and they needed some walnut logs, and the old guy was skidding logs with mules. And I said, I need some oak. And he said, oh, okay, that's going to cost you a lot. Then I asked him the question of what I really needed. I need walnut. He said, oh, I can get all that you want. I go, what? He said, oh, yeah. He said, those skidders, those fancy skidders can't get around, but my mules can. And we can go around those holes without any trouble at all. So tell me what you need. Cut it up, brought it up to the building in beautiful downtown Dupont, which was called Prairie du Pont. We changed names. Platte River was called Platte River, and then Dupont was called Prairie du Pont. Which would you prefer? So anyway, so these mining shafts are everywhere, and you have to pay very close attention to them, but this is the 3-notch road would end right about here, and they would go back and forth. So this is on 00, just north of Fredericktown. Next slide, please. So, back to the roots and the trails. This is the second oldest trail. Bergamot settled in Fort New Orleans. You ever hear of Fort New Orleans? It's near Brunswick, Missouri, on the Missouri River. It's 174 miles west. St. Louis is only in here to designate that's where St. Louis is at, so you'll get an idea of where they went. This is a group of people going up and building a fort in the middle of nowhere. Think about this. St. Genevieve, you're on the Mississippi River. In 1724, you're on the other side of Columbia. 174 miles up the river. And then he decides to take a trip to what is Wichita, Kansas today. Pretty gutsy fellows for the time to travel and cut routes and trails, thinking you're going to come back. And you're crossing through all those Native Americans who are going, what are you doing here? And you're by yourself. And you only got one gun that fires one bullet. And then we've got arrows and we can take care of you pretty quick. But he managed to make it. The fort existed for about 5-6 years, and then they abandoned it. Partially, we think, because the river got to it. And the other thing was they were kind of outstretched, a little further than they should be. Next slide. This is one of the river plats and some of the maps that show up. You can see Fort Duchard on the other side. And you can also start to see the Saline, St. Genevieve being founded. And there's some roads being built in the 1770s. The King's Highway. Again, we have the 3-notch road. Next slide. This is a map, if you've never seen it. you get a chance to look at it up close and personally. This is the Nicholas Definiel map, who drew such details that a fellow by the name of, oh God, I can't think of his name, Terry Norris said he could look at this map and find a house site and be within 30 feet of its original site from his map. Is that not an impressive map? He drew it very detailed. It also does something, anybody know about the Count's House south of town, now owned by the National Parks? Back when I was here, there was battles between the University of Missouri and thank you. And anyway, there was a running gun battle about where the Count's house was located. State of Missouri did dendrochronology, dated to the date they requested. All the documents dated the same date. They purchased it, not they, Dr. Susan Flaughter purchased it and gave it to the state of Missouri, the Count's house on its original site. The problem is when you started looking at it, it had machine cut square nails in places that it shouldn't be, had notches cut in places it shouldn't have notches cut. And the question was, where was it? Nicholas Definiel drew a map, and on the map it says the Count's house is overlooking New Bourbon. The Count's house is not overlooking New Bourbon. You have to look up and north to see New Bourbon, and you can't see it anyway from there. So anyway, what's going on? So they did an archaeological dig, and guess what they found on top of the hill by the giant pig pen? A foundation where the Count's house used to stand. So that map in the 1700s and those lines basically proved that that building is not where it belongs. It was either moved down by the Kearns family or a family that was there earlier, which we think the Kearns family took it apart, brought it down, put it together as a one-story building, but they didn't put all the French casement doors and all that stuff. They just stuck it together and it looked like a German farmhouse. I was working on the Becker Bowl, and a fellow by the name of Ziegler, who lived up the street, who grew up in a French vertical log house and made enough money to tear it down and build a ranch house, and wanted me to go see it. And I go, I'm sorry, I really have no interest in seeing your ranch house, although it's got to be a nice one. And he said, this fellow by the name of Gus Kearns has this log house. So we get a hold of Dr. Osmond Overby, who does the Historical American Building Survey, and we said, there is a monster of a house down the street. So we all started looking at it, all the documentation. This fellow would be the father of the last lieutenant governor of Upper Louisiana. Okay? And because of this map and that road, we found out that, uh-oh. So now the National Park has it, and what they're going to do with it, I don't know. I suggest an interpretive piece on how you can take a house apart and put it back together again, all not the way it came apart. You can come to my park and I can tell you how to take a house apart and put it back the way it's supposed to go back together, so we could use it as a cross thing between St. Louis County and the National Park System as a study guide. Anyway, next slide. So if you get a chance to see Nicholas Definiel, this is a closer map. This is St. Louis, and you can see the roads starting to come in the 1700s. You can see St. Ferdinand. Does anybody know where St. Ferdinand is? There's a shrine up there. Very interesting place to go visit. You can see the road going over to St. Charles, and then you can see Bonham Road, which takes you out to where Chesterfield's at today. And there was a French community on that river located there. So you can see the traces in the roads starting to come in. A lot of them were basically buffalo traces, things such as that. We wiped out all the buffaloes and started keeping. The Native Americans would use the trails. Also, the Native Americans would use the trails from the Salt Springs up to St. Louis, which had a group of over 28 mounds. And they were either traveling on the river or they were packing the salt up. Because what is salt? One of the most valuable things you can get. Saline Creek was a hot site. I was reading a journal and it was talking about Lewis and Clark in St. Genevieve, and there was a guy digging a well at the Salt Springs. He was down 17 feet and found an Indian pot. It is in a museum in the East Coast, that Indian pot that came out of a dig where the guy was digging the well 17 feet down. When the Earth Watch people were down here, they went down 9 feet in the ground and they were still finding pots and ash where they were burning and evaporating salt. This is not something that happened overnight. This is the development that occurred. They also found a 1776 French post-in-the-ground house site that was down there just a little bit above the floodplain. So anyway, these maps help draw in locations of what you can see and the trails and where they're at and what goes on. And you can find a lot of interesting things in St. Louis. We found when we could see maps and drawings and street scenes of where houses were exactly. Underneath the 64 bridge, there's about 3 French post-in-the-ground house sites that are there. Next slide, please. This is St. Genevieve. Oh, this is Florissant, I apologize. And St. Charles is in the north, where the Missouri River bends up there at the top. You got Carondelet down here in the south, and Cahokia over here on the other side. Next slide. Here's another view of New Bourbon. And then the road that travels through there is on the hill, it's not below. And that's what they did. Next slide. That is again the New Bourbon tract. And it's interesting that the priest owned it. So anyway, you can see the trails and river there. Next slide. Major roads, such as the Oregon Trail and the Santa Fe Trail, also started in Missouri, along the river and normally north of the river because it was easier traveling than the south side. Keep out of the hills and the mountains as much as you can. You can see where their crossings at and where they crossed and where the little towns would start to be established. Next slide. This is what would happen with the King's Highway from St. Louis going all the way down to New Madrid. It was started in the 1770s and would develop. And you can see where things happened and grew. A couple people had, Herculaneum Moses Austin had a trail coming from Potosi. I don't know if you know of a fellow by the John T. Smith. Quite an interesting character. You would not want to meet him if you owned land and didn't have a clear title, or he didn't think you had a clear title. He would challenge things with duels, and he was in 17 duels and won every one of them. He outlived all the people he dueled against, and will wind up buying your stuff because he was appointed by our first governor of the territory as judge and sheriff of the St. Genevieve district. Kind of a scary little fellow. Came from Tennessee, put T in his name because he didn't want to be confused with all the other John Smiths running around. And I don't know if you know the history of America, but as soon as you landed on the boat and you were in trouble in Europe, change your name to John Smith. There's a bunch of them. So anyway, so these are some of the places that they would use for shot towers and things like that. Herculaneum smelting plant up there, and if you notice, there's Indian mounds. So anywhere we decide to build a path or a trail, you also will find that the Native Americans were there before you. And you'll find them on paths and trails up and down the river. Next slide, please. So, river transportation after the canoe, the dugout. Flatboats were big. What you'd do is load a flatboat up and ship it down the river, and then you would sell it. A fellow by the name of Abraham Lincoln did the same thing, except on the way down, he was attacked by a group of slaves that were trained by their master to pillage and plunder. So we had pirates on the lower Mississippi and probably the upper Mississippi too. Because if you're going down the river and you got a boatload of furs and the guy's sitting on the bank going, he's asleep. Doesn't take too much to take that boatload of furs, and there's no name on them. They're just beaver pelts. So those are some of the things that might occur. But that's where the river's coming out. You can see the flatboats, and then you can see those things to the right are actually trees coming out of that river. So you need to watch yourself when you're going down that, snags and everything. Next slide, please. So you load up everything in your flatboat, go down the Ohio and try to get up the Mississippi, which is a lot more difficult. But when you floated down the river like Lincoln did, they floated their crop down and then sold their wood, came back up the river, either walking or on a keelboat. Next slide. So you know where that's at? There you go. The theory was that the Indians would cross all the way over to the Illinois side to keep from getting anywhere near that, because that would suck you under. It's where Satan lived. And well, I don't know if they called him Satan, but that's my term for him anyway. You don't want to do that. The problem with flatboats is people tend to get bored and drink a lot. So you might run aground and... What's that?
That one in Perry County?
Yes, So anyway, activities and things to do on a flatboat. It's kind of a boring thing as long as you don't run into a tree or a snag. Next slide. That's what one would look like constructed, pegged together. They'd take it apart and sell it for lumber in New Orleans. Next slide. This is the famous 55-foot keelboat. Lewis and Clark built one. They built it in Pittsburgh. He built the white boat and the red boat behind it, which were around 30 feet long. They came down the Ohio and up the Mississippi and up the Missouri to the Mandan village, in which they loaded the boat, shipped it back, and that's what Jefferson got to see. Elk and things like that that they had shipped back to him. I think they even caught a prairie dog before it went back, and it lived for quite a while. Not the other one, but the one did. So anyway, they would go up the river. That's them leaving St. Charles. I like to make a joke about this journey. Everybody made it except one guy, Sergeant Floyd. You know what he didn't do? He didn't go to the Catholic Church on Sunday and pray before he left. Sorry, it works really good in Catholic communities. So anyway, next slide. So pushing with poles is one way to do it. Sails and poles is another way to do it, or rowing. Next slide. So you take that rope, you tie it on the mast, and you would pull from the bank and walk up the bank. You can get to a certain part of Missouri and then the bank started falling off the side, so that didn't work out so well. So going up a river is absolutely miserable when you're trying to pull it, row it, or pole it. So anytime you get a chance to win, you could use it. Next slide. This is the Fulton, Claremont, built by Robert Fulton, which is the first steam engine. If you notice, it's a side wheeler, paddles on both sides. That would be the design of the next slide. The Zebulon Pike, which lands in Missouri in St. Louis in 1816. Steam powered. Notice the rudder. It's not a wheel like you'd think a riverboat. It's a rudder on the back end, would go up the river. You can get up the river, they say, in a very, let's see, I can't remember, I had that written down. In 16 days, I believe it was. I think the fastest trip was between the Natchez and Robert E. Lee. It was, I think, 18 days and 21 hours and 58 minutes. So anyway, that would be what the first steamboat landing in St. Louis would look like. Next slide. This is downtown St. Louis. I want to notice the high hump on the north side. There were multiple, like I said, over 20-something Indian mounds in the city of St. Louis. It was a very large community. It wasn't as big as Cahokia, but it was almost as large. And they would supply the salt from Salt Lick here. They were not going up the Boone's Lick, although I think that's part of the reason Fort New Orleans was founded, was to get to that salt. But anyway, they would ferry boat cross, generally flat boats, and then the steamboats after a while. Next slide. This is a ferry boat down here on the lower left, and they would pole across. You're not going to run a rope across the Missouri or the Mississippi River, because the next guy going down with a boat's going to get snagged and they're going to cut your rope, and there you have a 400-foot rope cut in two, which is going to get away from you, and what have you got now? A broken rope, and you're out of luck. So you're not going to always land where you want to, but you'll get close. Frederick Bates would go to work. At that time was the capital of Missouri, which was in St. Charles. He said he was 14 miles from the capital. He would go down and get on a ferry boat owned by a fellow by the name of John Lewis, which would sell it to another fellow by the name of Francis Howe. Francis Howe would actually own Frederick Bates' land and bought it. He acquired it as a speculation. And if you did not like land in St. Louis County, Mr. Howe owned land in St. Charles County. So much so, they named a school district after him. So anyway, this is, I believe this is Hermann, Missouri at the time. Next slide, please. So you go from river boats to roads. Roads were generally muddy paths unless you're in southeast Missouri and you got mud till about that deep, and then you got rock. So you don't grow a lot of crops in the rocks, but you got a lot of hills to get over. And then you get down in the valley and you get nothing but mud. So this is one way to smooth it out. It wasn't the best way, but it was a way. Next slide. So this is how you'd travel. Oxen, horse, whichever you could. Oxen are slow. They're not real bright. You have to remind them about every 3 steps that they need to walk again. So your speed would be about 2 miles an hour. Thomas Jefferson said horses traveled about 5 miles an hour on average. And if you think about that, that's also your communication, 5 miles an hour. So if you had a document that went from St. Louis to Washington, D.C., multiply that and do 5 times an hour, 5 miles an hour without with including breaks, and it's going to take you a heck of a long time to get communication from from Missouri to the Louisiana Territory to the Capitol to ask Thomas Jefferson what you're supposed to do next. And by the time they get that information back to you, you've already had to make a decision, and it might be wrong, which might be why Lewis had to go visit Washington, D.C., but the problem was Jefferson was not president, Madison was, and Madison didn't have a whole lot of love for Mr. Lewis, and he wasn't doing what he wanted him to do, so partially because of communication or lack thereof. Next slide. So another form of transportation, of course, the Missouri mule. Strong, steady, won't overeat, won't oversleep, or overdrink, like a horse will, and moves a lot faster than an oxen. So the prime animal that would be picked in this area to haul lead, or which continued to do up until the 1920s and 30s, would be the Missouri mule. Next slide. So this is some early territorial roads that were used to go south and north in the territory of Missouri. Next slide. This is another road. These are little wooden blocks that almost look like brick, except they're turned on edge, and those are oak, and then they put the pine pegs in between them. There was actually 2 streets in St. Louis that used this technique. I have one of the blocks I was going to bring down, but I got in a hurry and forgot all about it. But anyway, if you want to come to my park, I'll show you. It's sitting in my office. And anyway, so they'd put these blocks down, and that's what they'd use as a road. Next slide. That's another example of it. Next slide. And that's what it looks like. So it's not a plank road, it's wooden block road. So everything sets with grain up. They've got to be pretty tight or you'll break it off and end it up pretty quick. And it lasted long enough for somebody to pour asphalt over it, which is a lot of the granite pavers up in St. Louis that came from over in Iron County. Next slide. So, the state of Missouri decided they need to build roads. So they passed a law that you could build a wooden plank road. You had to get people to buy stock in it. You had the longest one in the state of Missouri. There were over 30 plank roads in Missouri. The longest one ran from here to Pilot Knob. It was 42 miles long, I believe, and the deal was they could cut wood along the way, and they would use a steam-powered sawmill. You had to buy stock in the company. The Central Plank Road Company ran from University City to Howell Island at his ferry boat. Convenient location to end your plank road. Frederick Bates' sons both bought 5 shares of stock. Next slide, please. That's a plank road stock, Central Plank Road. If anybody would like to buy a share, they're $100 a piece, and I'll write as many as you want, okay? So anyway, started in 1851. Fred's sons both bought 5 shares of stock. They had a steam engine. They cut trees along the way, and they would lay them. There's a couple different ways to lay a plank road. The one we have, I'll show you, and the one that was here, I think, is exactly the same way. The roads are about 8 feet wide, and the planks are staggered so your buggy or wagon can get on or off. The loaded wagon has the right of way. The empty wagon has to get off because it's a whole lot easier to push an empty wagon out of the mud than it is a loaded one. So basically you're going across 32. It runs in that direction through Farmington and all the way into the iron mines. Next slide. This is the remnants of a plank road. Next slide. This is one they're laying. Now they're laying this running this way, which is okay until the wood starts to flip and then your wheels get stuck. So they normally lay them the opposite direction, but this is one example of laying a road. Next slide. There's the normal way they laid roads in Missouri. You can see that they're staggered left and right, and they're about 8 feet wide. Next section. There you go. So this plank road right here, you can see they made different types of roads. I have not found a corduroy road built in Missouri, just the planks. And like I said, there were over 30 plank roads built in Missouri. They never lasted a real long time. I believe the story is that at your museum, there's one piece of the plank road left. It's a right thickness, but I'm not sure what it is. Okay, so could be, So anyway, so they put a ditch for drainage on both sides. You can see that that plank road is 12 feet wide. Most of them are no more than they had to be. By 1868, the plank road in St. Louis was in bad shape. I think by the Civil War, they talk about the road falling apart here, the Iron Mountain plank road. Now the problem with that was when St. Genevieve was building a plank road and not making money at it, St. Louis was building a railroad. So the rails would go down, go back to St. Louis, and that's where the iron would go. That's where the lead would go. So instead of it coming here anymore, it went north, which is a bad thing for some people, but a history person who likes history and old French houses, this is a wonderful thing, because had you all got your railroad built first before St. Louis, then all the iron and ore would be coming here, and you'd have new skyscrapers and all that on the riverfront, and St. Louis would have been suffering. So I'm glad St. Louis has that and you have this. I would prefer to be here any day than where I'm at now. So I live in a vinyl-sided house. In a neighborhood, when I started there, living there, it had 2,800 people. Now it has 90,000. Yes. And we went on an old road back and forth to the Schnooks way up on Highway 70 because there was nothing there. Now I got one within 10 feet of my house, seems like. So anyway, next slide. So you're building a road, you got to build a bridge. You build a bridge, you got to build it out of something. And before they started making iron bridges, like the Apple Creek Iron Bridge, that's a Pratt Truss Bridge in 1870s, I believe, 1870, 1880, they would build wooden bridges. Well, wooden bridges last a while and then they start to rot. Next slide. Came up with another way. I believe this bridge dates to around 1856, 57. This is the Burfordville Bridge, or Bullinger County. It's next to the Burfordville Mill, which was burnt during the Civil War, so they reconstructed it. I think it was a frame structure, and they rebuilt it out of brick. I worked down there for a short period of time. I lost my paycheck. I came up here, met the Wilhelms, and they offered to pay me every Friday $3.35 an hour, and I went to work for them because they lost my paycheck in the Burfordville post office. It went in one side of their little mailbox and out the other. They found it a month and a half later, and by that time I had gotten 2 or 3 paychecks from the Wilhelms working on the Becker Bull House. So I think I did a good thing. I love it here. This is a wonderful place. But anyway, working at the mill, we got to grind grain, and that bridge was very important because you could get the grain to the mill and you could get across without any trouble, and the siding and the roof protected the frame. There were over 30 covered bridges in the state of Missouri at one time. Now there's 4. This is one of the nicer ones. During the flood of 1981-82, it bent it a little bit, and they had to straighten it back out. But it's all interlocking pieces. If you get a chance to go to this bridge, Sandy Creek Bridge, go in and look at it. It's quite a piece of artwork. So anyway, so this road would go from Burfordville to Jackson and down on into Cape Girardeau. Next slide. So this is the Burfordville Mill and the bridge, and this was a general store. Unfortunately, I didn't get a shot of the one that lost my paycheck, but it was similar to that one right there. It's not in business anymore. I don't know if because their mail was really poorly delivered and taken care of or what, but anyway, so you can't drive across it. When I was there one day grinding grain, I hear a tractor trailer honk its horn a few times while it was driving across that bridge. He should have been shot, but he went across it and the bridge held. So think about a tractor trailer with a trailer on the back of it going across that little wooden bridge that was built in the 1850s. Next slide.
Hey, one on that one right there. My dad, when I was a little kid, took grain there to get it ground.
Oh, really? And your last name is?
Fliggy.
Oh, that's right. Okay, so I'm related to the Bullingers, and there's another mill in Bullinger County that is in sad shape, but it has all the equipment in it, and there used to be a mill next to that one too. So anyway, this is the Sandy Creek covered bridge, and it's up in Jefferson County, and that's one of the others. Next slide. And that's the other bridge up near Pershing's home, and that one is in better shape than it looks right there, but it's happened to be the shot I had at the time. So anyway, so there's still 4 of them up and around, and those are 3 of the shots. Next slide. So if you don't have a bridge, You got to figure out another way. You don't want to use a flatboat if you can figure out another way. And one of the ways they did, notice the date, 1832, they had a steam-powered ferry boat. It'd take you across the river and bring you back. Notice how the animals loop around where the steam engine's at. It would have paddle wheels on the side. You can't see them because it's turned sideways, and they would go back and forth across the river from Illinois. Now this would continue until the 1870s. You used to have a transfer boat here to transfer trains back and forth, which seems absolutely incredible to me that a train doesn't fall off in the river, but it seemed to work. I was here when they were building the model of it, and it was quite an undertaking to watch him. We took it up, uncovered it, took a shot on the river, and you could not tell the difference between his transfer boat and the original one in the photograph. So, next slide. This is up in Michigan. Notice the wheels turning on the left and right and the horses in the middle. You're not hauling a lot of cargo with that one. You're more or less taking passengers across. Next slide. This is another more ingenious device, which I only found one of these was in use at the end of the plank road in Columbia. Columbia built a plank road down to the river because they didn't want to be right next to where Jefferson City was at, because they were after cargo and stuff themselves. So they would build a ferry boat to cross over, and that's the type of ferry boat they had. Next slide. This ferry boat, believe it or not, was used up until 1941 in, what's the name of the little town on the Missouri River? It's west of Hannibal, or west of Herman. And this was used, so what happens is those scrawny horses walk, and it turns the wheel on each side. So what you do is you call the horse's name if you want them to stop or start. And that will adjust the boat. So if you want to go left, you go Jack. So Jack starts pedaling and it goes to the left. And you want to go right, you hit Joe. And then Joe starts, and the other one stops, and it straightens it out so you get back and forth across the river. Now again, you're not landing exactly where you think you might be. So you might have a little difficulty unloading, but it's better than nothing, right? It's better than a flatboat that you might wind all the way up in St. Charles by the time you get across the river. So river moves about 4 miles an hour. So you got to take that into consideration. So you're going to head upstream first and try to cross it that way. Next slide. Now as the riverboat started developing, this is, I believe, Herman, Missouri. You could get up and down and cargo was shipped. There's over 500 of these that sunk between St. Louis and Kansas City. Next slide. There's an example. Now that's the example. We have a house that was built in 1846, and the family came from Germany, and they were told, do not go to New York City, they will steal you blind. Go to New Orleans, but never go in the sick months of the year. That's when malaria occurs, and they didn't know malaria was malaria until the Panama Canal was built. So it was the swamp sickness, they thought, and the hot weather down in New Orleans. Well, it was mosquitoes, of course. So this German family landed in January. No mosquitoes, right? They land in January, but the problem is the Mississippi and Missouri and Ohio River are wider and not as deep as they are now because they're channeled. So they would freeze. So now they're trapped in New Orleans for another month. The ice finally breaks loose. They get up to a place called Cairo or Cairo. They pull in there, they're sitting at the dock, and now the ice is coming down from both the Missouri and Mississippi, and 4 of the 6 boats get crushed. Like that. They don't disappear. It's not the Titanic where they go down 1.5 miles into the water. They just sink and the boiler's underwater and they're busted up. So they pile everything on the 2 ships that are left. The German family, there's 3 brothers, 3 first cousins. They get to a place called Kaskaskia. Now the river's too low and the boat's dragging bottom. So they have to wait. This is a letter we had, and the letter said, we waited and waited, and one of the 12-year-old children passed away, and they're buried on top of the hill at Kaskaskia now. And anyway, the crew gets in a fight with the captain because they wanted money to go drink. And he goes, I'm not paying you, you're not doing anything. So they got mad and left. They went south. We get another boat, we don't care. So the Mertz family had to learn how to operate a steamboat. So you wonder why there's a lot of steamboat explosions on the Mississippi River. It might be because people didn't know what they were doing and did it anyway. But they got the land office in St. Louis. They bought 30 acres for $300. And Mr. Duden said you could buy 30 acres and live happily ever after. He got a nickname as Lying Dog Duden, but anyway, people bought land and they lived better than they did when they were in Germany, where basically some great big rich fellow owned everything and you never had a chance. So they would take their chances with stuff like this, and they would go up the river. Well, when these boats sink, some of them would sink out of sight, there was another fellow that came along. Next slide, please. You know who he is? A fellow by the name of James Eads. That man saved St. Louis. That man saved Ulysses S. Grant's butt on more than one occasion, because what he was hired to do, next slide please, after he did this and retired when he was about 40-something years old, this is a dredge that has a diving bell on it that he would go under and pick up the supplies that came off those sunken river boats, and he would sell them. He did it so well that he sold everything, but this is one of his pieces of equipment that he would use on the Mississippi River. Understand, there's no bridges. You don't have to worry about going under a bridge, so you can be as high as you want. And notice the name, Submarine Number 7. It really wasn't a submarine, but there was something on it that went underwater. Next slide, please. That right there. So they would lower them down over the ship. They would reach down, pull out what they could, come back up, do it over and over and over again. And he made enough money to retire. So when he retired, he's kind of minding his own business and playing things. Oh, by the way, he's considered one of the top 5 engineers in the world and never went to school a day in his life. Not a bad shot. Next slide. So anybody seen the Arabia? The Arabia is a time capsule, a fascinating time capsule. So when I think about Mr. Eads, I think about him figuring out a way to save as much as he could off these ships. And this is a perfect example of what happens when the river changes courses and whatnot. So 1856, whatever they pulled up there, which is in great shape because it was in mud, which you'd think mud. But anyway, it's a wonderful time capsule and an archaeological dig. Supposedly when they dug it, they originally found the halter with the donkey or mule that was still tied to the deck. They never cut it loose. Don't know why, but they didn't. Anyway, next slide. So what Mr. Eads did in 100 days, he built 6 of these ironclads. Because Grant was going down to island number 10, and those little wooden steamboats were getting blown to pieces by those cannons sitting inside the forts on both sides of the river. He knew he'd never take Vicksburg, and he would never take Fort Donelson, and he would never take anything else. And so a fellow by the name of Edward Bates, who was a Virginian, whose brother had been the 2nd governor of the state of Missouri, came here in 1814. He was a co-founder of a place called Alton because of the lime, because you need lime to build houses. And so he co-founded Alton, and he was fascinated with railroads in the 1850s, before the Civil War. He went to Chicago to talk about train transfers and how important it was to build trains and develop trains in the western part of the United States. But he needed a bridge. So he went up there and spoke, and he spoke so elegantly that he was a Whig, changed from Whigs to Republicans, goes up to the Chicago Republican Convention, in which he comes in 4th. Not 1st, not 2nd. Matter of fact, Lincoln didn't come in 1st. They swore that they would not make any deals, but they did. So Mr. Bates turned his votes over to Mr. Lincoln. Mr. Lincoln gets nominated for President of the United States. Edward Bates gets appointed Attorney General to the United States, helped write the Emancipation Proclamation, and his best friend was Mr. Eads. And he said, Mr. Eads can build the boats you need to protect your soldiers and get past these islands, which he did in 100 days, 6 ironclads. One of them still exists. Go to anybody been to Vicksburg, Mississippi? You've seen the Cairo? That was built by Mr. Eads at Carondelet Ironworks. So he built iron-plated boats and changed the course of the battles up and down the Mississippi River. which basically broke the South in a quarter, not really a half, because you only have Texas, Arkansas, and some of that stuff on the West Bank. And Missouri, if you're Confederate, not so much if you're a Union soldier. But anyway, so that's what he would do. Next slide. And that's the Cairo that sunk. It had a mine hit it underneath. It went under and they pulled it up, and it's in the national park, and they're rebuilding it right now. So if you want to see it being reconstructed, now's the time. Well, on a warmer day, it's time to go see it. Next slide. Next slide. Mr. Eads again, very important to me because he's the guy that built that bridge, of course. So anyway, Mr. Eads, after that, Mr. Bates and him started talking about constructing a bridge. And this was in 67, 68. Unfortunately, Mr. Bates dies, so he loses that connection. But there was a major railroad man who said there's a fellow that can build, the only guy I know of that can build a bridge across the Mississippi River is Mr. Eads. So Carnegie, who then was a railroad man, went and talked to Mr. Eads and asked him if he could build a bridge. And he believed he could. So instead of building it out of iron, Carnegie had it built out of steel. The only problem with that, Carnegie owned an iron mill, not a steel mill. He had to buy it. His last purchase was $1 million worth of steel to build that bridge. So they built the first iron bridge across the Mississippi River. Now there was a bridge north. The reason for the bridge north was Chicago did not want St. Louis having a bridge. So they would pass rules and regulations to keep them from sinking piers on the Illinois side of the river, because they had a bridge going up to St. Joe, crossed over upper Missouri, would cross over and go and get the cattle, take them to Chicago, to their slaughter yards. Didn't want them to go into St. Louis or East St. Louis, didn't want them down here, didn't want the competition. So in order to crush the competition, you don't let them build a bridge, because they build a bridge, now they got railroads. We had railroads here since the 1851, 52, they started building railroads, but we didn't have a bridge to get across the river. You had to use transfer boats, which was a difficult situation. So Mr. Eads starts on the bridge. Next slide. This is Edward Bates. Is the first person to have a statue in Forest Park, which still stands today. They spray painted him a little bit because they thought he was a Confederate, but he actually was in Abraham Lincoln, so they cleaned him up and left him alone. He hasn't been spray painted since, but they thought every statue in Forest Park was a Confederate, and so they spray painted him a little bit, cleaned him back up, but he was the Attorney General for Abraham Lincoln and definitely helped Mr. Eads get that bridge going. Next slide. So this is Edward in the back corner. He would serve for Lincoln for 4 years. He'd retire, come back to St. Louis because he wanted to be a Supreme Court judge, and Mr. Lincoln wouldn't let him. Pretty shrewd man, Mr. Lincoln. He basically, Edward would let him throw people in jail without the writ of habeas corpus. And Mr. Lincoln decided that guy should not be the Supreme Court judge because he might bend for the next president. Make sense? So Edward came back a little hot, but he also wanted to be with his wife, who had produced him 18 children. 2 fought on the Union side, 1 fought on the Confederate side. God bless her. Yes. Most of them lived. Had a farm out in western part of town. Matter of fact, he was a bit of an arrogant fellow because after his brother died in 1825, he took his brother's children to raise on the farm because Fred's wife wasn't capable of handling children. Fred's wife is the great-great niece of George Washington's mother. If you have that kind of background, you ought to be able to raise a couple kids, right? Anyway, so that's Edward. Came back, started St. Louis City school system, worked on streets and railroads until he passed. Next slide. This is the railroad system in Missouri. I believe it's 1859, and you can see that they're spreading out pretty far and pretty quick. But the key thing, if you notice the other side is starting to get railroads coming into it, is that bridge. Next slide. One of the earlier locomotives. First locomotive I've seen a photograph of is 1851. You didn't get photographs before 1848, but there's one of them dragging a steam engine or a locomotive off a boat. It looked pretty precarious, but they managed to get it up the hill and get it on the tracks. Next slide. This is the Hannibal-St. Joe Railway. You see how far it is? It's up there at Hannibal. They didn't mind that. Hannibal's never going to be much of anything because all they're doing is transferring our cattle up to Chicago, to the Chicago stockyards, and all that wheat and everything else you can possibly handle. They would haul carloads and carloads of buffalo bones to make fertilizer out of. So that's what they were doing. They were trying to keep St. Louis out of that loop. Next slide. And there's some more of the signs of towns that show up. They would sell over 6,000 acres of ground on both sides of those railroad tracks. Next slide. Downtown St. Louis, see, 1860. The bridge would be built in 1874. And guess who else didn't want the railroad? All those steam engines. Those steamboats did not want the competition of a railroad coming across that river and cutting down on their money. And everything came up and down the river. It was done with a riverboat. When Mr. Eads came along and built that bridge, that slowed down their money-making operations. Next slide. And there's the bridge coming up in construction. We have another place in the park, the blacksmith, landed in New Orleans in 1872. He was asked if there was any work for blacksmiths in New Orleans, said no, but we hear there's a crazy guy in St. Louis that thinks he's going to build a bridge across the Mississippi River, and they laughed. Well, he got on a boat, came up. Story goes, according to the family letters, that he basically went down, knocked on the door. Eads came out of his little shed. I think it's over here to the right. And he made him blacksmith for an hour. After he did that, he said, you got a job. The reason he left Germany, all of his cousins, brothers, and uncles were blacksmiths in this little town in Germany. So he had to do something. So he came to Missouri and made the rivets for the bridge. When he got done, he went to a place called Spanish Lake, Missouri, and built a blacksmith shop that ran until 1992. It was a 3-generation thing, and then a fellow took it over who taught classes at a junior college. And we took it apart and moved it to the park, and we have it in operation today. But to think about a guy who made the rivets on the bridge working in that blacksmith shop is kind of a neat thing. Oh, they were going to tear it down to put a Dollar General store. Well, they did. We took it and moved it, and they put a Dollar General store there, so it's kind of where the parking lot. I forgot to tell them about the cistern that's sitting in the middle of their parking lot, and they'll find it someday, but I figured I owed them something extra. So anyway, this is the bridge going together. Mr. Carnegie spent an extra $1 million. The bridge cost $10 million to construct at that time. That's a chunk of change. But in order to make the riverboat people happy, he made sure it was tall enough for the stacks to go underneath the bridge. It's the arch. So that arch is there. And I do believe if you look out to the river on the left, you'll see 2 black things sticking up. Those are smokestacks from a riverboat. So I look at it as the beginnings of the train and the demise of the steamboats. And it's kind of a nice little demise if you think about it and you're a railroad man. But anyway, next slide. So, my favorite view. You've got empty grain cargo going up the river with a barge. You've got that river bridge that's still being used today. They haul people across it and cars across it, and the train goes across it. And then you have the arch, the gateway to the west, and it should be basically over the top of Mr. Eads' bridge because he is the gateway. So that basically ends my story. I have 2 more slides to show you. Next slide, please. Can you see that black spot in the river? There's a statue underneath that. Next slide. It's of Lewis and Clark. I don't know why they picked that location, but they did pick him up and move them, because underneath him, I think that's Clark, and then Lewis is down below with his dog on a boat. So they decided that that's not a good spot to have him. So without that railroad bridge being built, you'd still be crossing with a ferry boat, and that wouldn't be a good thing at all. So anyway, that basically ends my slide presentation. If there's any questions about anything, whatever it is, how bad it is, how do you get your money back, let me know. Question? Yes, sir.
What was the lead so valuable for at that time?
What's the what?
The lead mine.
Use it for everything. Paint, soldering, lead pipes, You know, if they really start looking in downtown St. Louis, a lot of people are drinking water out of lead pipes. You have them here, your old houses that you work on. If you look, the sewer lines, sewer pipes are all out of lead. So it's used for almost everything. That's why lead paint's been banned, because it's heavy lead, because it holds up. The problem is, if you eat it and lick on it, you're gonna get in trouble. Kind of like anything else, everything we do seems to have a repercussion somehow or the other. It's like petroleum, it's like solar, nuclear, everything has something that's going to get you. But anyway, so that's what lead's used for. Bullets, during every war we've ever had, those shot towers that were used by Austin and Smith, those were used, the bullets were, lead was taken down and used at the Battle of New Orleans. So, and that's one of the things that the state of Missouri said, we deserve to be a state because we helped provide ammunition for the War of 1812 and numerous other things. We provide lead, and at one time this area was the world's largest lead producer and smelting plant. Moses Austin, interesting character. You know who his son was? Stephen F., the father of Texas. I don't know if you've ever heard the story, but in the 1930s, there's some Texans come up to dig up Mr. Austin over in Potosi. He's still buried there, by the way. So apparently it didn't work. And the story goes that, have you ever been to Potosi? There's an old cemetery in town behind the, well, it's behind a little church and behind the Masonic Lodge and behind the courthouse, which was designed by a guy by the name of Theodore Link that built Union Station in St. Louis. But anyway, they came to dig him up. It was a Sunday morning early, and a fellow was squirrel hunting, because you can see stumps of these great big oak trees. So he was squirrel hunting in the cemetery that morning, walks around the corner, and these guys, what are you doing? So we're taking Moses Austin to Texas where he belongs. Supposedly he cocks back both barrels of his double-barrel shotgun and said, today you're not. So they poured a concrete slab over the top of him, and I went up there the other day and they built a pavilion over the top of him. So now the only way the Texans can take him, because they like to steal, people like to steal bodies out of Missouri for some reason, I don't know why. Daniel Boone, maybe he's in Kentucky, maybe he's not, I don't know, but they took something down there. So anyway, Moses Austin's still there, so when I give a lecture about the mysterious death of Lewis and Clark, I tell them that now you because I have people from all over the country, a lot of Texans, I'll say the only way you can get him now is that horizontal drilling and fracking that you do. You'll have to drill underneath there, suck him out with salt water, and then you can take him to Texas. But if you go to the battle that they caught the president of Mexico and made him surrender, you'll see inside that giant building with a giant granite Texas star on top of it, the grandfather of Texas is Moses Austin. And he lived right around here. And he built roads and he developed the territory, and it was road development. If without roads and transportation, we'd still be walking or riding a horse at 5 miles an hour. And you know what Thomas Jefferson said about a horse? It's going to ruin the youth of America, because they're just going to want to ride all the time and they won't want to walk anywhere. I'll end it with that. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Hey, Jesse, would you tell the people about the loom that you salvaged here at St. Genevieve and brought back to St. Genevieve?
Oh, you got me, didn't you? Okay. Yeah, I promised to put that back together too, didn't I? Yeah, I know. Now in front of witnesses. Okay. So, we're up in a house in St. Louis. Lady says, I got these pieces of equipment. I used to weave and all this stuff. And I got this loom that I bought in St. Genevieve. I brought it up here and I've had it for years. And I don't know what to do with it. So we went over to her house. The house had broken water pipes in the basement for apparently quite a while. So that's why there's some of the rot on it. So we took it apart and brought it to the park because it was ancient. It's definitely an old loom. And she said it came from St. Genevieve, and actually mentioned the lady it came from. I won't remember that because I'm getting kind of forgetful. But anyway, it was sitting up there and we're going, what are we going to do with this? We have looms, really don't need this one. So I called up these folks and I go, I got something for you. So we brought it down and gave it to the museum. So it's still there. We can put it back together. I don't think it'll ever be operational, but you can make it look so. Maybe somebody smarter than I could get it to work, but I'm not a loom operator. So anyway, so that's the story of the loom. But it's a beautiful piece, and I think it probably dates to 1790s, 1800s, at least that far back. And back then, everybody made their own clothes from whatever they could get. Flax, hemp. Hemp was a big product in Missouri. Matter of fact, a lot of the river transportation, a lot of places were going up that Missouri River to Little Dixie, and they were collecting hemp. They weren't smoking it at that time. They were making rope out of it. And St. Louis used to be a rope manufacturing town, and the last rope manufacturing place, I think, burnt. But before it burnt, they found a rope that was over 100 feet long, about that big around. So, but it was made out of hemp because it's the strongest material to use for that. Any other questions? Yes?
Where did they move that?
You're going to have to speak up.
Oh, I'm sorry. Where did they move that statue of Lewis and Clark to?
A little higher up on the river. It's up on the granite instead of right. They thought it'd be cute where it looked like the boat was coming out of the water, but it was going under the water, so that didn't work so well. Any other questions? Did I talk long enough?
You talked much.
Are they going to let you keep their money? Are you going to let her keep her money? Okay, all right, I'm good then. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you, Jesse. That was wonderful. Can I tell you, he's a great storyteller. That concludes our evenings. Feel free to stick around and visit if you like, and be sure and visit the museum. We thank you for supporting the St. Genevieve Museum Learning Center. And we certainly thank our sponsor for this evening, Riverside Landscaping. Another applause. Be careful going home, and we'll see you soon.